So the subject of this video is something that I do have personal experience in dealing with, and so I'm really just going to be sharing my own outlook of these mental and emotional states and really discoveries I've made and a strategy that I've used that's really helped to completely transform the way I perceive stress, anxiety, and depression. And really, the strategy has helped to really change my perspective on life. Now, anxiety and depression and panic attacks, chronic fear, habitual negativity, all of these things are so widespread that it really is beyond a mental health epidemic. Now, there's so many different causes to these conditions, ranging from poor diet and lack of exercise to environmental toxicity, the stress that's the result from overworking, or maybe not getting enough sleep, or overexposure to mainstream media is a really big one for a lot of people, as well as challenging family life and the pressure of social expectations. All of these things, plus a lot more, can all give rise to states of mental and emotional instability. Now, there's many different strategies aimed at bringing relief from these conditions, such as proper nutrition, herbalism, meditation, and the practice of mindfulness, spending more time in nature. And then you have also the more conventional methods such as psychotherapy and counseling, and also treating the symptoms with pharmaceutical medication. And most people, in my observation, actually do try to medicate in some way, whether it be with pharmaceutical drugs or with more holistic stuff like maybe herbs or certain foods. And really, the reason why I find people tend to do that is because they just want to take stuff and make the problem go away. I think this is maybe a kind of social byproduct from this age of extreme convenience that we're living in, where people want results without putting in any work. But really, this kind of strategy, it's not a viable long-term strategy at all. Now, foods and herbs really are amazing tools for improving health on every level, but in terms of our mental and emotional and spiritual well-being, I feel that they're only really going to work as much as we're working on ourselves. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about in this video. I feel that things like nutrition and herbalism should really act as a support for the path that we're currently on, rather than a substitute for it, if you see what I mean. Now, of course, I think a multifaceted approach to healing is always going to be the best option, because addressing something from many angles simultaneously is bound to yield better results. But what I'm going to talk about is more of a complete change of perspective, that if we can fully understand it and implement it and incorporate it into our life, then it can have really a profound application in transforming our mental and emotional problems into powerful tools for personal development, rather than obstacles that inhibit personal development. So, this change of perspective that I'm talking about is really about zooming out from these problems and really getting more of a big picture view of them. And from there, we can try to change the way that we perceive the problem itself, rather than getting all caught up in the details of the problem. Because I think that if we can really change our perception of the whole situation, then the details tend to become kind of irrelevant. So really, this whole thing starts with seeing these negative perceptual and behavioral patterns not as surface issues that can be scraped off or removed in some way, but more as the expression of something that is held deep within us. Now, these deep-rooted problems are often referred to as, somebody's dark side or personal demons or something like that. And really they can manifest on the surface as a number of different things, like a lack of self-confidence or low self-esteem, or maybe a complex about the way that we look. Maybe we think we're too ugly or too fat or too thin or whatever it may be. Also, it can manifest as uncontrolled emotional states such as anger and frustration. Or maybe someone has a poverty mentality or a victim mentality, or they suffer from social anxiety and panic attacks, or they have chronic long-term depression, or maybe obsessive compulsive disorder, or really just always projecting their own inner negativity out onto others. Now, regardless of what may have caused these feelings, it's easy to become incredibly upset by them and really attempt to detach from them in order to feel some sense of relief or some sense of peace. But in my opinion, this is really where the problems really start to get out of control, because these demons that we may be battling with are not actually separate from us. And so it's not possible really to detach from them or escape from them or really distract ourselves from them permanently. They're an integral part of our own unique personal makeup, and so escaping from them is really like escaping from ourselves. It's not possible. So unfortunately, in our society, we're really conditioned to only seek out pleasurable experiences and really avoid negative feelings at all costs. And this is really what can force our behavior to become more repetitive and to descend into negative habitual tendencies that become increasingly more destructive over time and ultimately just further exacerbate the problem. And from here, it can become really easy to develop compulsive disorders, like certain, weird relationships with food, or maybe obsessing over just meaningless details. And it can escalate much further, where we can develop dependencies that range, again, from food or caffeine or nicotine to beyond that into alcohol abuse, or really the abuse of hard drugs like cocaine or heroin. All of these things can really start as a means of escaping from our problems, really. But ultimately, they're only going to make things progressively worse in the long run. Distracting from our internal problems with external forces, it's never really going to work. The more we try to avoid dealing with these issues, really the larger and more powerful they become, quite often leading to feelings of complete overwhelm that really can be incredibly destructive and in many cases fatal, because a lot of people just become so overwhelmed and just can't cope anymore that they opt out of this life, which is obviously incredibly distressing and sad. So really, I also think that to some degree, medicating with pharmaceuticals is a lot of the time it's really just another short-term distraction rather than a long-term solution, because the symptoms may subside for a while, but often when you remove the drugs from the equation, the problems manifest again, and quite often they manifest much more aggressively than before. So it is my feeling and my experience that genuine transformation of all of these conditions, it can only really take place when we're willing to work on ourselves and we're willing to evolve past these inner obstacles. So, from my own practice and my own experience, meditation, breathing exercises, and incorporating the practice of mindfulness into daily life is something that I've found to be of key importance in manifesting a complete change of perspective. Because these practices can really help us to identify our thoughts and our emotions as passing phenomena that are really not permanent. Many of us have a very strong tendency, I think, to define ourselves and define who we are by our thoughts and by our feelings, as well as our possessions to a large degree. But mindfulness and meditation can really help us to observe our thoughts and our emotions really as just moments that arise and then pass all by themselves. And really, the only thing that makes them repetitive is our attachment to them. So really, this change of perspective that I'm talking about it's really, really simple. It's really uncomplicated. And it's really just an idea that we can perceive our problems from another angle. And if looked at from a different perspective, these problems that have been tormenting us and inhibiting our happiness and fulfillment can actually become potent catalysts for personal growth. They can actually become a really powerful driving force that I think can springboard us into progress extremely quickly. Now, meditation it's an excellent way of detaching more from our emotional relationship to these negative states of being, and it can really allow us to observe them without such a strong reaction, and really it can really reduce the amount of influence that these problems have over our behavior. It's a really, really great first step, but it doesn't remove the problem, it just makes it more manageable. So really, this next bit is really the key crux of the matter, or at least for me in my experience. If we can manage to consciously share the same space and spend time with these uncomfortable issues that we have, and we can really give these problems the space that they need to fully express themselves, then I think we can expect to see some pretty amazing results. This requires a great deal of self-respect, and it requires, self-love and nurturing ourselves as whole beings, rather than only focusing on the bits of ourselves that we like and ignoring the rest. So really, I think this kind of self-love is the only real long-term route to liberating these afflicting problems. And interestingly, it's also how these problems are actually pointing us in the direction of our own personal growth, because these problems are encouraging genuine self-acceptance. So really, once this problem or dark region of the soul, or whatever you want to call it, once it has been included and accepted and given the chance to fully express itself, then the negative and debilitating effects of it often really tend to subside quite quickly, because I think that the problem has now had the chance to feel a sense of satisfaction almost through the positive attention that it's now getting and the recognition that it's now getting. And this can really just be as simple as just admitting to ourselves that we have this problem, whatever it may be, and it's perfectly okay to have this problem, and it's not wrong in any way. And from there we can really try to examine the problem and see how it makes us feel. When does it happen to us? And we can really try to understand that it's not permanent, in the same way that this life that we're living right now is not permanent either. Sharing the same conscious space as this problem, completely free of judgment, really, it can bring about dramatic results really, really quickly. So to kind of go over it from another angle, I think it's really good to compare this process that I'm talking about to a child that is quite badly neglected by its parents. Now, that child, say, it never receives any praise or encouragement, and instead it's just constantly ignored or shouted at. And it feels that no matter what it does, it never feels loved, and really becomes very frustrated that its needs are just never met. And so the child naturally resorts to misbehaving and causing all kinds of trouble just to get the attention that it craves. And I think it's exactly the same thing can be said about the darker regions of our consciousness that we reluctantly drag around with us. I think it's basically out of some form of neglect that these problems can escalate completely out of control. And really, with the right kind of care and attention, these problems can be transformed really into an evolutionary leap forwards. And managing to perceive ourselves in this undivided, non-judgmental way is it's already a huge leap forwards in itself. Now, this process of self-acceptance and not excluding what we feel to be personality defects, it's actually a completely natural process whereby, we really recycle things. We're really bringing personal obstacles to the surface so that we can recognize them and then process them in the appropriate way. It really is just a form of recycling. We take something that is no longer useful, and we can recycle it into something that we can use. So perhaps another way of looking at this is if we compare it to the natural process of a tree dropping its leaves every year. The tree does this, obviously, it no longer needs the leaves in this part of its annual life cycle, but also because those leaves are going to fall around the base of the tree and they're going to break down into valuable nutrients that tree can harvest great benefits from over the long term. Those nutrients are going to nourish the tree. And, I think just as the tree does this every year, I think we also need to look at composting our mental and emotional waste products regularly. It really is an ongoing process that evolves over time, and doing this once is going to bring positive change for sure, but doing it only once doesn't really bring much in the grand scheme of things. It's something that needs practice. It needs to be done regularly. And if we can learn through mindfulness and observe things as they come up, it's easier to recycle them nice and early on in the process and prevent them from becoming huge obstacles to our own happiness and fulfillment. In saying that, the bigger the problem, the bigger the opportunity for personal growth, but also the bigger the task is going to be. So, this strategy I'm talking about, it's really not at all hard to understand. I think it's as simple as really just not dividing ourselves in half with what we deem to be good qualities versus bad qualities. But instead we can really try to see ourselves as a whole being that attributes equal validity to every aspect of ourselves, whether it makes us feel good or bad. And really anything that acts as an obstacle to our personal progress can be, in essence, composted and in turn fertilize our own potential. So if we want to make progress in this life, then I think that these problems and blockages that we have are 100% necessary, because if we can implement this kind of practice that I'm talking about into daily life and over time declutter our minds enough, I think that we can begin to make room for true intuition to develop, which is really the whole point. That's where all these problems are pointing us towards developing ourselves and our intuitive faculties, and really becoming more comfortable with trusting ourselves, and basically just becoming more fulfilled spiritual beings. So really that's kind of a summary of my understanding and my outlook and my experience of all of these negative and stressful mental and emotional states of being and how to transform them. Obviously, there's a lot of other stuff that you can do, a lot of stuff you can take, but that's not really the topic of this video. That's something I can cover in future videos. And in fact, the first few videos I ever uploaded to YouTube kind of cover that in some way, so you can always go back and watch those. So I hope that was useful. I hope I explained it properly and clearly enough. If you have any questions, again, you can always contact me. And yeah, take care and see you soon.